What's the most terrifying thing you've seen in real life? Story 1. Not sure whether this makes me fortunate or unfortunate, but the most horrifying thing I have ever seen is completely imaginary. I was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic at the age of 14, although I first started showing early signs at the age of 7. I hallucinate constantly, both visually and audibly, and the actions of my visual hallucinations can cause me pain. I would assume they can cause pleasant feelings from touch as well, but I have yet to experience that. The entire manifestation of my illness seems to be attempting to make me as miserable as possible, and it is almost like another entity in my head. That being said, most of my visual hallucinations are human-like figures, entirely black and lacking any real defining features. They do not resemble anyone I know, as far as I can tell. They do, however, seem to enjoy making me as uncomfortable as possible by just leering endlessly. They are always there, usually just watching me. It feels like I am being criticized constantly for every movement, every action. It has made me incredibly self-conscious over the years. Anyway, I was sitting in my room at the age of 15. It was late at night, and my family had been asleep for hours. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud behind me. I had been hallucinating for a couple of years at this point and did not think anything of it, assuming it was another fake bump in the night. Then I felt a hand over my mouth and a swift, sharp, agonizing pain in my ribs. Still to this day, I consider it the most painful thing I have ever felt. The feeling of the hand left my face and my head collapsed onto my laptop. I grabbed my side, which felt warm and wet. I saw a shadow slip out my bedroom door as my vision became blurry and the room started to spin. And for a full 20 minutes, I could not move. I was in too much pain. My body was going into shock, and I managed to peek down at my side, and it appeared I was bleeding heavily. I could feel the blood running down my body and hear it dripping onto the carpet. My mind was racing with thoughts of my family being murdered. I heard my dogs barking wildly, unable to get to the intruder as we had installed a door at the end of the hallway to the back of the house so the cats could have some peace from them. My heart pounded louder than I could deal with. I heard screaming of how much of a failure I was, how I was a complete idiot, that it was all my fault that my family had been killed. Tears rolled down my face, and finally, I let out a scream of some sort. A few moments later, my sister opened my door, turned on the light, and the nightmare vanished. The pain in my ribs dulled significantly, but still burned. I lifted my head from my keyboard, and the pool of blood below me was gone. I pulled my hands from my side, and they were suddenly clean and dry. My sister looked at me with a worried expression, asking what was wrong, wondering why I was bawling and screaming at 2 a.m. I sobbed even harder, and all I could offer as an explanation was, "I am just insane." That was the night I realized I would have to deal with this for the rest of my life, that I would experience traumas and stresses that never existed for the rest of my life, that I would question the motive and intention of every single person, relative or stranger, for the rest of my life. But hey, at least in the end, most of my fears and worries end up being made up. Story 2. When I was younger, I kicked a ball over the fence of my father's friend's house and naturally stepped on the fence and poked my head over to see how far it had gone. I saw a man a decent distance away in the backyard, so I called out asking if he could pass my ball back over, but he was not responding, so I asked my sister if I was seeing it right. She looked and thought it was a scarecrow. I went to tell my father and his friend, and they looked at it and called out, but still nothing. They jumped the fence to check it out, and it turned out I was calling out to a man who had hung himself to pass my ball back over. A few police officers came, and that is about all there is to the story. It was not really scary, just creepy. I was pretty young, but it did not really get to me or anything. I do remember it pretty clearly, though. Story 3. A hand grenade flying through the passenger side window of my Humvee. I was already on edge to begin with, and that was definitely the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. The second most terrifying thing was the aftermath of that grenade. I lost a hand, broke both legs, and was missing part of my foot. Guess what? I did not lose consciousness. After seeing my hand missing and my feet and legs pretty much mangled, I definitely struggled to stay with it. I remember how either my brain or body or something made me feel like dying was acceptable. It was kind of a dreamy, peaceful feeling. That scared me. Story 4. I worked as a healthcare security officer in a rather large locked psychiatric ward. One day I was leaving dispatch and happened to catch on our old black and white monitor a man sitting in the middle of the main floor. Something struck me as wrong. Suddenly I saw a black puddle beginning to form under the man. I ran up to the unit, and there sat a man in a puddle of blood. I called for backup, but he stood up and ran at me. I fought this man for about 5 minutes, both of us covered in blood. His eyes were dead, like those of a shark. It turned out he had sat on the floor and ripped out the stitches the emergency room had put in after a suicide attempt. Story 5. My friend had an aneurysm while taking a leak. He had just smoked marijuana, and his wife ran to my house next door to get my and my other friend's help. She refused to call the police because the house smelled like marijuana. I found him with his pants down on the bathroom floor and screamed at her that she needed to call 911 immediately. So my friend and I dragged him out of the bathroom, shoved some ice down his pants, and I began CPR. First responders in order: emergency medical technicians, police, and fire department. He would not wake up, but he still had a pulse. I was hopeful. I found out a little later it was an aneurysm and that he was brain dead when I was giving him CPR. And for months after, his wife kept him on life support and prayed and prayed. They finally took him off, but I heard third or fourth hand because I had transferred to university elsewhere. Halloween night, 2004. Story 6. When I was 17, I still lived at my mother's house. We were in a middle-class neighborhood, so it was not necessarily a bad area for the most part. I was taking out the garbage one night as the sun had just gone down. I walked the first garbage can out, and these two men were arguing across the street. I walked back and got the second one, and when I turned around, one of the men lifted a gun and shot the other in the head at point-blank range. The man with the gun stared directly at me, then turned and fled. I was surprisingly calm about it until I was on the phone with the police. Then suddenly I started freaking out and panicking. As far as I know, they never caught the man. Story 7. Mine was not so much seeing something as it was experiencing something. When I was 11, my father took his own life, and I had absolutely no way of properly handling the situation. When I was told the news, I did not even react. I just sat there quietly because my brain could not comprehend the idea that the man who was my best friend had decided to leave me behind. I made up all these excuses in my head about what had really happened. The most realistic being that he had faked his own death and was just trying to get away from everything. Even his funeral did not mean too much to me, as he was cremated, so it fit into my story of him still being alive. It took me about 3 to 4 years to really understand everything, meaning that it finally clicked in my head. I started to notice all the strange details I had not realized when I was younger. Things like the time I came downstairs and found him sobbing for no reason, or the looks of devastation he would have on his face from time to time, despite our family having fun at an amusement park. His note topped it off, as I was not told that he had written one until around that time. He talked about how my sister and I were his world, and that he wished he could stay around and see us grow up, but the world was just too much for him. I learned that he had been extremely bipolar, and that was why he would have those fits of rage followed by sadness I had just deemed part of his personality. I ended up becoming extremely fearful that I would end up like he did, and am honestly still scared every time I get angry or sad. It was not something immediate or something you could see and quickly look away from. It was a realization that my best friend had been so mentally ill that he could not stand to keep himself alive. And that is the scariest thing I could ever possibly imagine. Story 8. I came from seeing a movie at the mall with my 2 teenage sons. We had arrived separately and parked our cars in different sections of the lot. After leaving the movie, I was driving up a ramp and saw, out of the corner of my eye, my son's car with the front end smashed in and smoke coming from the front. I quickly made a U-turn, and as I drove toward them, I could see my older son, the 17-year-old driver, standing outside the passenger door with my younger son, his 14-year-old brother, in his arms. The passenger airbag had deployed, so the 14-year-old had a nasty scrape on his face from it, but thankfully they were both okay. I hope I never feel fear like that again, ever. Story 9. I was taking my dog, a yellow Labrador, for a walk with my father when I was maybe 8 years old. We had just started to head back to the house, and about halfway there, a bear appeared in the middle of the street. The bear was standing on its hind legs, about 12 feet tall, looking angry as could be. My father put me behind his back upon noticing the cub on the side of the road, because he knew this bear was not going to back off if it thought its cub was in danger. The next thing I knew, my dog charged at the bear full speed and tackled it down the hill off the side of the road. My father and I both thought that was the end of our dog until about a minute later, we saw her strolling up the hill without a scratch on her. She had wrestled a bear all the way down the hill and won, most likely saving both my father's and my life. I truly love that dog. Story 10. Seeing someone get hit by a car. I was maybe around 10 years old and I was being driven to the doctor's office for a checkup when we stopped at a stoplight. There was a man crossing the street to my left who looked down the road and started running across the crosswalk. The next thing I knew, a car drove through the light and slammed into him, launching him straight into the air before he landed on the ground with a loud thud. Looking at him, there was no movement whatsoever. He was just lying there motionless on the road. Luckily, we were just down the road from a hospital and there was a police officer right across the street. We drove off from the scene with the woman who had hit him in absolute hysterics. The thing that sticks with me the most is the sound of the car hitting him and the oomph he made when it happened. Story 11. Catching a young woman high on methamphetamine, rummaging through tools in my father's garage. The look on her face when she realized a larger man had confronted her in a confined space was one of pure terror, and she was ready to claw my eyes out to survive what she most likely perceived as a threat. When she turned to run out of the garage, my police officer father caught her by the arm and held her down until other officers arrived. Watching her fight, beg, and plead that we would not hurt or kidnap her was heartbreaking when we had only the best intentions of getting professionals to handle her drug-induced meltdown. The struggle was so intense that we decided to handcuff her to keep her from hurting herself or us. We later learned that she had been on the run and was being chased by police because she believed she was being hunted and in danger of being kidnapped inside a hotel. We were her worst nightmare in her mind, and it certainly looked like it. Story 12. When I was around 15 years old, I lived with my Vietnam veteran father on a pretty busy street in East Los Angeles. Car crashes were fairly common. You would hear a screech and a crunch, then grab the cordless phone. This was 1995 and some towels, walk outside, make sure everyone was okay, and call 911. Most of the time, the people were shaken up but fine. You helped direct traffic and kept everyone calm until the police arrived. One day, though, we heard a screech and then a thud, not a crunch. That meant someone, not something, had been hit. We looked outside and saw a woman lying in the road about 20 feet from the crosswalk. At the other end of the crosswalk was a tipped-over baby carriage with an infant on the pavement. This one was going to be bad. My father and I followed the usual routine, grabbed the phone and the towels. I never knew what the towels were for, but my father told me that day in the most direct military tone I had ever heard. "Grab 2 towels, I'll cover the 2 bodies." We ran outside. The infant was crying, and I had never felt so relieved to hear that sound. An older woman picked up the baby from the gutter. My father started lecturing her about moving injured people, but she had seen the accident happen. The woman had been crossing the street pushing the baby carriage, saw the car coming, pushed the stroller toward the curb, and took the full force of the impact herself. The stroller rolled to the curb and tipped the baby onto the asphalt. We did not know if the baby was completely okay to be moved, but we had another person to worry about. The woman was alive but badly hurt. She was missing teeth and bleeding from her mouth. Her knees and shins were scraped so deeply that we could see bone, and her arm looked broken. She was conscious and crying. My father told her not to move and warned all the bystanders not to touch her. The whole time, I was on the phone with emergency services relaying the information he gave me. Her boyfriend showed up, a heavily tattooed man crying like a child, shoving people aside to reach her. My father stopped him, but instead of saying, "You can't," he told him, "Hold her left hand." The man dropped to his knees and did as he was told until the ambulance arrived. We did not need to use the towels that day. Later, we heard that she had a broken arm and shoulder, but both she and the baby were going to be fine. Years later, I moved to an apartment right on Sunset Boulevard in the Junction, and once again, car crashes became normal. I went through the same motions my father had taught me, but one morning, a large pickup truck T-boned a sedan, carrying 4 people making a left turn. I had to use my towels that day. Story 13. When I was about 10 years old, I saw a man fall from a ladder and die. In Cincinnati, Ohio, some of the hills are extremely steep, and the buildings are tall to compensate. The man had to be up 4 stories or more. I was young, so I am not sure. My half-sister, who was 13 years older than me, was driving, and she was crying her eyes out. I did not really understand what I had seen. He had been on the ladder. There was a flash I later learned was him hitting a power line, and that was why his ladder shot out from under him and he landed in the street. I am not sure whether being electrocuted killed him or the fall did. Story 14. I was one of the first people to arrive at the scene of a car crash that ended up killing 3 people. It was surreal. I was coming over a hill and did not see the crash happen, but the dust was still settling. I pulled over and immediately ran down into the ditch where one of the cars had come to rest. Both people in that car were okay, so I went back up to the road where the driver and passenger of the second car were crawling out of the windows. They both looked to be about 16 years old. When I got closer, I saw 2 girls lying in the road, one clearly dead on arrival, and the other gasping for air with a collapsed lung and multiple compound fractures. She was bleeding badly and was surrounded by people trying to keep her awake until emergency medical technicians arrived to intubate her. All of that was shocking, but the scariest part was the behavior of the young driver. I talked to him for a long time to try to keep him calm. For the first 5 minutes, he spoke as if we had just met under normal circumstances. I asked his name and where he went to school, and he answered normally. Then every once in a while, he would suddenly snap to reality for a few seconds. His eyes would change, and he would begin to panic, then just as quickly slip back out of it and resume small talk like nothing had happened. I have seen people in shock before, but never like that. Story 15. I witnessed a friend die when I was a kid. My friends and I used to play by this creek. My cousin's house backed up to woods, and the creek was about a mile deep behind their home. We played there pretty much every day during the summer. One thing we used to do was swing from one side to the other with a swing we made. One day we were swinging, and one of our buddies, Josh, slipped. It was not uncommon to slip. You usually just fell in the creek, got wet, and went home to change later. This time was different. Josh fell backward and hit his head perfectly on these large rocks by the edge of the creek. The impact was so bad, and he was bleeding heavily. My brother jumped in to make sure he did not drown. I ran back to my aunt's house with one of my cousins and a friend. My brother, other cousin, and another friend stayed back. We got help, but it was too late by that point. It was just a freak accident. We had fallen so many times off that swing, and nothing ever happened. He just fell wrong that day, and it ended his life. I could hear his parents' screams from my aunt's backyard when they got there. It was awful. I still cannot watch movies that involve children dying, and as a father now, I cannot imagine letting your child out to play and then finding out they died. It made me realize that life is short and accidents can happen anywhere, so it actually made me less overprotective with my own kids. That experience changed me as a person. This happened in 1995. For those wondering, that was before cell phones were common. I was 11, and we were all between 11 and 13, so we probably would not have had cell phones, even if they were popular. Having one would not have saved my friend, but that is why we had to run a mile to get any help. Story 16, I worked at a gas station when I was 18. One night at the end of my shift, the overnight employee did not show up. I called my sister to see if she would hang out with me until I could reach someone. Around 4 in the morning, an ambulance slowed down right in front of the station. As it stopped at the light, the back doors opened and a man jumped out. One paramedic hopped out of the back, chasing after him. The man ran straight toward the station, looking terrified. He turned left to run again, and we noticed that the back of his head was missing a large chunk, blood running all down him. The medic continued to pursue him through the parking lot next door. We called 911 and explained what happened, but dispatch responded, "Yeah, right." About 20 minutes later, police arrived to take a statement from us. The man had been high and injured, trying to escape. I never found out if they caught him. Story 17. I saw my mother giving my brother CPR on the beach after he broke his neck and almost drowned. He had been in the water for about 4 minutes. Then I watched the helicopter take him away, not knowing if he was dead or alive. He defied the odds and went on to live another 36 productive years as a quadriplegic. I was with him when he died a few years ago. We had some good times. He was body surfing at Rehoboth Beach in 1980 when a major storm or hurricane miles offshore caused the waves to carry farther and break harder on the shore. He was basically pounded into the sand headfirst. He went on to graduate high school, college, and some law school. Eventually, he went into social work and advocacy. He was able to work until about 40 and lived until 52. He broke the same vertebra as Christopher Reeve, but was able to breathe on his own. Doctors told us not to expect him to live past his 20s. Story 18. I saw a 5-year-old girl fall about 30 feet from a chairlift while skiing. When she landed, I was about 15 feet away. She landed on her stomach. I called ski patrol immediately, but the time it took them to get there felt like an eternity, even though it was probably no more than 5 minutes. I had no medical training other than basic, do not move the injured person. But since her face was directly in the snow, I took my jacket off, held her neck and head still, and had a nearby person slide my jacket under her face. It was shortly after Christmas, so I tried to distract her by asking what she had received from Santa and sang her favorite Christmas song. I kept holding her neck still until ski patrol arrived and sent her in the ambulance. Later, I found out that although she had some bad bruising, she walked out of the emergency room that same day. The girl had wonderful parents. Even though it was the holidays, they contacted a therapist immediately and got her back out skiing just a few days later so she would not develop fear. About 5 years later, I became a member of the National Ski Patrol, a volunteer organization that usually serves smaller resorts. Story 19. I saw a car crash when I was a child. My father stopped the car to help. He made me stay in the car, but I saw one body on the ground surrounded by a growing puddle of blood and another body hanging out the window of one of the cars. Blood, glass, and car parts were everywhere. Horns were honking, and people were screaming. My father came walking back to the car shortly after he got out. I asked what had happened, and he said there was nothing he could do. He pulled into a parking lot and waited for the police to arrive. I remember being impressed by how fast the firefighters cleaned everything up. You would think seeing the bodies would be what stuck with me, but what I remember most was the pale, lifeless look on my father's face when he came back to me. Sometimes your best intentions cannot do anything, and I could tell it affected him deeply. Story 20. I saw a girl get struck by a boat propeller from her heel to her neck. I had just turned 22 and was living in Austin at the time. My friends and I decided to go out on Lake Travis for my birthday weekend, so naturally we went to a club a few days earlier to invite some dancers and cocktail waitresses to join us. Saturday came, and we were having a great time on the lake, drinking. Everyone except the driver, who stayed sober all day. One of the girls had too much to drink and realized she had lost her phone. She started panicking, saying we needed to take her back to the bar, where we had lunch, or she would jump off the boat. We told her not to worry, that we would go back and look for it, and if we could not find it, we would all pitch in for a new one. She was not calming down, and soon she tried to jump off the boat. We restrained her and thought everything was fine. 5 minutes later, she suddenly jumped off the front of the boat, taking one of the guys with her. My best friend Nathan and I instantly sobered up. He jumped into the water while I threw out the life ring. Then we saw the water behind the boat turn red. Nathan swam to her, and I helped pull them in as quickly as possible. There were about 14 people on the boat, but only 3 of us acted fast, the driver, Nathan, and me. When I pulled her aboard, everyone started screaming. Her back was shredded by the propeller, from her heel to her neck, with exposed bone and torn flesh. The guy who fell with her somehow escaped unharmed. The worst part was applying pressure to her wounds. As we headed to meet the paramedics, I sat on the back of the boat, pressing on her back while she screamed and begged me to stop because I was hurting her. I knew I had to keep going to slow the bleeding. It felt like forever, but I managed to keep pressure on until help arrived. I honestly thought she would not make it, but she survived. When we visited her in the hospital, the doctor said that if it had not been for the 3 of us staying calm and acting quickly, she would have died. Story 21. My family used to go camping in Ontario, Canada. When I was 16, I took our small 14-foot fishing boat out before dark and lost track of time. A huge storm kicked up 4-foot waves and hail and threw the boat into rocks, dumping me into a shallow cove on a large peninsula connected by wilderness to the mainland. It was dark, and I had no way to contact anyone, so I flipped the boat, made a small shelter, and hunkered down for the night. I woke up to the sound of loud howling. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the tree line. About 20 feet away, a wolf was snarling at me. I scrambled under the boat and spent the entire night using my fishing pole to keep it from digging under the side. I have never seen anything as terrifying as a wolf trying to kill me. Story 22. My wife gave birth to our daughter when she was only 19 weeks pregnant. Technically, it was a miscarriage. My wife's cervix was not strong enough, and something ruptured. After I realized I was not going to be a father anymore, I stopped listening to the doctor. My wife went through all the stages of labor for about 7 hours. Our daughter was born weighing only 12 ounces. I held her, counted her toes and fingers, and saw her heart beating through her tiny chest. Then I saw it stop. I had my hand under her back as I carried her, and I would gently press it in rhythm like a heartbeat so her chest would rise, pretending she was still alive. It was the worst day of my life. This happened almost 4 years ago, but I still remember it like it was yesterday, and I cried while writing this. I now have a healthy 2-year-old daughter, and I am endlessly grateful for her. I would not wish what we went through on anyone. Story 23. 3 years ago, a friend and I were driving back from downtown, just chatting. He was driving, and I was in the passenger seat. I noticed something lying in the street near the local drive-in theater. From a distance, it looked like roadkill, but as we got closer, it was clear it was a person. The man got up and stumbled toward us as we slowed to make a U-turn. Just as my friend turned the car around, there was a loud thud. I looked to my right, and blood was smeared across my window and mirror. My friend stopped immediately, and the man began banging on my window, begging for help. He was a large man, and half of his jaw was missing. It looked like something out of a horror movie. He had been shot in the face and chest, and it was clear that only adrenaline was keeping him alive. My friend froze in fear, but I jumped out to help him. My friend thought I was crazy, but I did not care. I just wanted to save him. As my friend called 911, I tried to calm the man down, holding his hand as he stumbled to the curb. He could only say, "Help me, please, I'm dying." I looked toward the drive-in and saw a pickup truck crashed into a telephone pole with the driver's window blown out. We were near a dangerous part of town, so I knew instantly what had happened. The police arrived, followed by paramedics who took him to the hospital. We were questioned for hours. It turned out that someone had shot him through his car window while he was driving. It was not random, he had been targeted. They never discovered a motive, and the shooter was never found. He died from his injuries the next day. I will never forget the look on his face or the sound of his voice as he tried to speak through what was left of his jaw. Story 24. I have been waiting to say this for some time. My father drowning. It happened a couple of summers ago in a local river. We were wading and catching catfish. The water was low, as it gets every summer, so it was easy to cross from one side to the other. Catfish like to stay in the deeper holes when the water is low, and we had to walk around one of those holes to cast into it. We were catching them nonstop for about 2 hours, and then we decided we had enough on our stringers. They were attached to his belt loop and mine. I had a bathing suit on, so I just wore a belt loosely around my waist. My dad had the idea to swim back across the hole instead of walking around to save time. Not his best decision. He was in front of me, and then suddenly he was not. He came back up saying he had dropped his fishing pole. I thought it was no big deal. It was a $60 rod, easily replaceable, but then it clicked. He was wearing jeans and lace-up boots, and I realized my dad was drowning. I went into survival mode, but not for myself, for him. I dropped my pole, undid my belt, and swam to him, about 10 yards away, trying to keep him above water. He was a big man, about 250 pounds, and it was not working. The hole was about 10 feet deep, so I dove under him and pushed his legs upward from the bottom so he could get air. I did this several times, but we were not getting closer to the edge. Then I decided to grab him by the collar and drag him along, and it worked. Within seconds, we reached shallow water. We were both exhausted. Then he told me a hook was in his leg and fishing line was wrapped around him. I felt around and realized it was the stringer with the catfish wrapped around his legs, and the hook was actually a catfish barb stabbing his leg. I untied it and threw the fish away. We finally made it to shore and just broke down crying. We lay there for about an hour. It was the most horrifying experience of my life, though I did not realize it until later. I could not believe how calm I was while watching my father nearly die in front of me. The sounds he made still haunt me, and it was awful seeing him so helpless. He threw up a lot of water afterward. It was the scariest 2 minutes of my life. Story 25. In third grade, my best friend and I were walking home from school. We usually took the path with the crossing guard at the busy street, but the shorter way did not have one. We got to the street, and he ran out first. I hesitated, and suddenly I heard screeching tires. I saw the car hit him so hard that he flew at least 20 feet into the air and landed with a sickening thud about 6 feet from the car. The jacket tied around his waist landed on the hood. The driver got out of the car, fell to his knees, and screamed, "Oh, God!" Traffic stopped, and people ran to help him. I snapped out of my frozen state and ran home as fast as I could to tell my mom that Derek had been hit by a car. He survived but was in a coma for 3 months and was never the same afterward. It made him slower, but we stayed close friends. Story 26. When I was about 8 years old, I was visiting one of my father's friends. They did not have kids my age, but they had a huge backyard that stretched up a steep hill, about 500 feet high, full of trees. It felt like a mountain to me. There were trails leading to the top, along with some water tanks and county pump sheds. One day I went exploring and saw a large water tank, about 20 feet tall and 40 feet wide. As I got closer, I saw a person draped over the edge of it. His skin looked greenish blue and he was completely still. I ran back and told the adults, but they did not believe me. The next day, they called my parents to say I had been right. The man had taken his own life on top of the tank. It was terrifying, and I had nightmares about it for a long time. Story 27, I saw the second plane hit the World Trade Center out my 35th floor office window, about half a mile away. The first crash happened behind me, and I did not hear it, but someone called me, and I looked out the window to see smoke and papers floating everywhere. I still thought it was a small plane accident and could not see the hole because it was on the far side of the building. I was wondering if it had been caught on video and was picturing what the crash might have looked like when the second plane hit right in front of me, on the side facing me. It slid in like a coin into a slot, and a moment later, a ball of flame shot out in several directions. A moment after that, my window shook. It looked exactly like what I had been picturing in my head, and for about 10 seconds, my mind could not process that what I was seeing was real. It was not until someone ran into my office asking what had happened, and I heard myself explain it, that I fully grasped it. I walked down 35 flights of stairs, walked miles home to Brooklyn, watched the second tower fall on television, then found my wife and toddler daughter at her gym class, and immersed myself in her world where none of it had happened. Story 28. I watched a man die after a police officer shot him in the head. The man was having a mental breakdown inside a coffee shop across the street from my apartment. I looked out when I heard sirens and saw him come out holding a terrified girl by the neck and waving a knife. I watched the standoff for about 15 minutes before they moved out of my view. Of course, I ran down to the street like everyone else. As I turned the corner, I heard the loudest pop I had ever heard and saw the man fall backward onto the sidewalk in front of the pharmacy. His face drained of color right before my eyes, turning from pink to gray. I had never seen anyone die before, and it shook me deeply. Whoever cleaned the scene did a poor job. There were still spots of blood and brain matter on the pharmacy door, and I thought about him every single time I walked by afterward. Story 29. I worked as a patient advocate at a hospital for about 9 months. My job was to ensure patients were satisfied with how they were treated, collect compliments and complaints, and check on everyone in the emergency room. We were also required to respond to all code calls because we were responsible for comforting the family members when things went wrong. We were essentially grief counselors on the front line, which was tough to do with only a bachelor's degree in psychology. I saw a lot of people die, but one of my first nights is something I will never forget. A man in his late 40s or early 50s was rushed in. He had cancer and was suffering from some kind of organ failure or cardiac distress. He was frantic, flailing on the stretcher, making loud groaning sounds. His eyes were wide open, darting around the room in panic. He looked right at me, and I saw his fear. It was terrifying. The nurses and doctors were trying to calm him down, calling his name, telling him to stay still, but he kept thrashing and making those awful sounds. Then he suddenly went quiet, lost consciousness, and at the same moment, he evacuated his bowels, a common occurrence, I later learned. The team started using the paddles on him, shouting, "Clear!" between the sounds of beeping machines. I could not believe I was witnessing it. Then his daughter burst through the curtains, and it hit me that it was my job to console her. I somehow got her to follow me to the quiet room, but she was inconsolable. I could not shake that eerie feeling for days. Even now, 5 years later, I still feel dizzy thinking about it. Story 30, I was 19 when I woke up in unbearable pain at 2 in the morning. My boyfriend at the time drove me to the hospital about 15 minutes away. I could barely breathe, lighting one cigarette with the other just to stay calm. It felt like someone was stabbing me in the left side with a butcher knife. My boyfriend started panicking, thinking I was having a heart attack, and he stopped caring about speed limits. About a mile from the hospital, a police officer was parked at a well-known speed trap. My boyfriend panicked even more when he saw the flashing lights behind us. He thought I was dying and decided to make it to the hospital no matter what. The hospital sat on a hill, and the road split at the bottom right to the hospital, left to the highway. By the time we got there, 3 police cars were behind us. One clipped the back of our car, and we stopped. I was furious at my boyfriend, but also grateful that he had gotten us that far. Then I heard my door open and turned to see a police officer pointing his gun directly at my forehead. I was holding my side and gasping for air, crying and begging for help. They kept yelling at me while I thought I would die, either from my body giving out or from a bullet. My boyfriend tried to explain, but they slammed him against the car and arrested him on 7 charges. One officer grabbed my arm, dragged me up the hill toward the hospital, and left bruises on me. I was later diagnosed with a pulmonary embolism, which can be fatal. In court, the officer claimed I didn't look sick. The judge ruled it a life-or-death situation and dismissed all charges except one. Story 31. My parents took me in as a foster child when I was 4 and adopted me a couple of years later. They kept fostering kids throughout my childhood, around 70 in total. As you can imagine, that came with both good and bad experiences. The most terrifying one happened when I was 13. A 17-year-old boy named Jack moved in. Every morning, he woke me up by punching me and laughing. He was smart enough to avoid leaving marks, and he told me that if I ever told anyone, he would kill me. After a few months, he ran away, and I felt nothing but relief. A couple of weeks later, I went outside at night to take out the trash and saw my dad's motorcycle parked behind the garage, which made no sense because it had snowed that day. I told my dad, and things spiraled fast. The cops came, found the freezer in the garage empty, and discovered that Jack had been staying 6 blocks away. They found meat wrapping from our freezer in his trash, but Jack was long gone. Months later, my mom and I were watching the news when a story came on about a group of guys who broke into an old man's house an hour away. They tied him up and robbed him, and after the others left, one of them stayed behind and beat the man to death. Then Jack's picture came up, arrested for murder. I still do not know when I felt more scared, when he lived with us, or when I realized later that he really could have killed me. Story 32. A man I considered a friend tried to take his own life in front of me. He had the entire day planned. He asked me to drive him up to the mountains and had me stop to buy a disposable camera. We stopped at one waterfall, then another, this one about 80 feet high. He asked me to take his dog down below and snap a picture of him. Right after I took the photo, he jumped. The waterfall was mostly dry, with a small pool at the bottom, no bigger than a coffin, in a ledge about 20 feet down. I ran to him, thinking he was dead, and tried calling 911, but there was no signal. Somehow the call still went through, and all the operator heard was, "Friend," off cliff, before my phone died. The emergency team did some incredible detective work to find us. The call had bounced off a tower in a different state. It took hours for them to arrive, and by the time they did, the sun was almost gone. He was airlifted to a hospital far away and stayed there for more than a month. He had broken all his ribs, punctured both lungs, torn his liver, broken his pelvis, cracked his skull, and had part of his wrist bone sticking through his skin. But he lived. He was the one who had gotten me hooked on meth, and I had been awake for several days when it happened. My mind was already unstable, and by the time the police found us, I was nearly out of my head completely. Story 33, I was playing with a friend outside the apartments where we lived. The parking lot entrance was on the far side of the complex, but about 300 yards away. My friend's father got on his motorcycle to go somewhere. As he rode past, he gave a quick beep beep on the horn. He went maybe another 50 feet before being hit head-on by an oncoming car. His body folded underneath the car as it skidded to a stop right in front of us. I remember seeing his brains. He was wearing a helmet, but it was ground down as the car dragged him down the road. I can still see that flashbulb moment, the smooth surface of the shredded helmet, and how little blood there was at first. Later I learned that the lack of blood meant he had died almost instantly, or that his heart had stopped by the time the car came to rest. There was blood later, but it never gushed. I went back to that spot later that day and saw a puddle of blood beside the road, covered in green, metallic-looking flies. I was 9 years old. I do not remember my friend's or his father's name, but I remember the motorcycle, a black and red Honda CB Hawk, and the car, a 1974 Ford Country Squire station wagon, the same as ours. I was more disturbed by the flies than the crash itself. The way they fed on human blood was somehow the most shocking part. I think I was in shock because I barely reacted at the time, other than being frozen by the sound of the screeching tires. Story 34. My boyfriend of 7 years sat up in bed and said, "I think I'm having a seizure," before collapsing into violent convulsions. I tried to hold him upright, but then he started gurgling, and I realized he was vomiting but could not open his mouth. I had never seen a seizure before, and it hit me that he could not open his jaw. I tried to pry it open for what felt like minutes as he continued to choke. Then suddenly his jaw relaxed and he projectile vomited. For a second I felt relief until I realized he was unconscious, and then that he was not breathing. I grabbed the phone and called 911. I barely remember the first part of the call, but I vividly remember the exact second it hit me that he was dying. One moment I was thinking, he's having a seizure, and the next I was screaming into the phone, "He's not breathing," while the operator calmly guided me through chest compressions. Emergency services got a pulse back, and he was taken to the intensive care unit, where he spent days in a coma on life support. The tests showed no brain activity. He was completely brain dead. I held his hand when they removed the life support, and for a few minutes his body stayed alive before turning green as the tissue began to die. I bolted from the room. It has been almost 4 years now, and I am finally happy again, in love again. But the months after his death were just as terrifying as the moment he died. I would not say I was suicidal, but there was a time when I would have welcomed death. Story 35, I was on a father-son campout with my church as a kid, sometime in the late 1970s or early 1980s, in a forest in northern Arizona. I was showing one of the younger kids how to catch the end of a stick on fire, wave it around, and make glowing shapes in the dark. I knew to throw the stick back into the fire pit when I was done. The younger boy did not. When his dad called him, he tossed the burning stick back into the woods. You can probably guess what happened next, a forest fire. At the time, it did not even terrify me, though it should have. The men and older boys formed a bucket line and fought the flames until firefighters arrived. I was one of the older kids not helping with the fire, so I tried to keep the younger ones calm as their dads hauled water from the creek. If the fire had smoldered unnoticed until we went to bed, it could have killed us all. Looking back now, I realize how bad it could have been. It felt surreal then. I was not afraid, maybe because I was too young to understand, or because some part of me was fascinated by fire. Since then, I have seen many stories of firefighters dying in wildfires, and every time, I think of that night and how close we came. Story 36, I am Syrian and lived in Syria for quite a long time. Before 2012, my neighborhood in Damascus was quiet, small, and ordinary, filled with families working average jobs, living simple lives. I had never heard a gunshot in my life. Then one day, war reached us. The bombing started suddenly, and our small neighborhood was hit by airstrikes every 30 minutes. The sound of a bomb falling and exploding is one of the most terrifying things a person can hear. When you hear jets above, at least you have a few seconds to take cover. But when they fire Katyusha rockets, there is only a faint buzzing sound a few seconds before impact. The rebels, outsiders who had taken positions in our area, used civilians like us as shields. The government troops, under strict orders to seal the area, refused to let anyone leave. Ordinary people were trapped in the crossfire. I saw the small market beside our home, where I had gone since I was 4 years old, reduced to rubble. Bodies of neighbors I had known my whole life were stacked in the streets. It was a nightmare that I wished no human being would ever experience. Somehow, my family managed to bribe our way out and escape. I will never forget the sound of those bombs, the sight of those streets, or the feeling of being caught between two forces that both treated our lives as worthless. Story 37, my 16-year-old nephew, his body cold, his lips blue, his mouth slightly open with dried blood around his perfect white teeth. I can still see him lying there on the bed at the Center for Organ Recovery and Education, covered from the waist down with a tan hospital blanket and a knitted afghan around his feet. I remember wanting to place my hand on his leg near his ankle, but stopping when I saw how crushed that part of his body was. I came to his side, and as I had done since the day he was born, wanted to run my fingers through his blonde hair and tell him I loved him. But the back of his head was too damaged, wrapped in a towel to cover the wounds. I had helped raise this boy. He was not perfect, but he was bright and full of potential. His death was a chain of small, cruel coincidences, each one preventable. It was prom season last year, and he was at a party with friends in the woods. There was an accident on a nearby road, and when the kids heard sirens, they thought the police were coming to break up the party. My nephew, who had been taught never to ride with anyone who had been drinking, called his best friend's father for a ride. The man drove toward them but was blocked by the accident and had to circle around to the other side of the road. My nephew and his best friend started walking down the road to meet him, their backs to oncoming traffic. That was when the best friend's older brother, high and drunk, got behind the wheel of his Jeep Wrangler with 6 other passengers. Around a soft turn leading slightly downhill, the Jeep drifted off the road by about a foot. That was all it took. He hit my nephew and killed him instantly. My nephew died cold, wet, and alone in the middle of the night, surrounded by terrified, intoxicated teenagers. The thought of how close he was to making it home, how many chances fate had to spare him, still breaks me every single day. Story 38. About a year ago, I was home alone with my sister, who had to stay home from school because she had strep throat. My mom was with her boyfriend and wasn't expected back until around midnight. I had no college classes that day, so it was just the two of us. Around 9:30, someone knocked on the door, claiming to have pizza for us. I told the guy he must have the wrong address since we hadn't ordered anything. He seemed to leave, and I didn't think much of it until about 5 minutes later when my sister said she saw someone walking along the side of the house from her upstairs window. We had security cameras around the property because of some local vandals, but none covered that side because of tall, thick bushes. I went outside to check the backyard and saw nothing. 2 minutes later, I looked through the screen door and saw our shed door wide open. I panicked, grabbed my 12 gauge, and locked every door. I didn't go outside. I called the police instead. When they arrived and searched the yard, they found the same man crouching in the back of the shed, holding a large Bowie knife. He had a history of armed robberies and had stabbed someone in a fight years before. That night still makes me shiver when I hear a knock after dark. Story 39. 2 years ago, on October 31st, at around 3 in the morning, my wife and I were asleep at my in-laws' house when the loudest thud woke us up. I heard my mother-in-law screaming my father-in-law's name while rushing toward the bathroom. My wife jumped over me and ran, and I followed right behind her. When we opened the bathroom door, he was on the floor, face up, staring blankly and struggling to breathe. My mother-in-law was shouting his name. My wife was crying and yelling, "Dad!" And I panicked, telling my wife to call 911 while I tried chest compressions. I had no medical training, but I followed the dispatcher's instructions. Nothing worked. The ambulance arrived 9 minutes later and took over. They used the defibrillator, tried everything, but he didn't make it. He had a heart attack at 53 years old. The blank look in his eyes, the gurgling sounds, and the helpless cries from my wife and mother-in-law haunt me. I still feel like I failed him since I was the first one there trying to save him. He had diabetes, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol, but never took care of himself. Still smoked, drank, and ate whatever he wanted. Please take care of your health. I'll never forget that night. Story 40. When I was about 8 or 9, I used to stay with my dad one weekend a month. I was terrified of the dark and hated sleeping alone, but he made me sleep in the living room without the lights on, sometimes with the television on low volume if I begged. One night, I was lying on the floor in front of the big screen TV while his Jack Russell Terrier slept curled up next to me. The doggy door, about 15 feet away, made a soft click when it opened and closed because of the magnets. I heard it click and didn't think much of it until I realized I was petting the dog, and he was right beside me. My whole body froze. I kept staring at the TV, too scared to turn around, until I finally gathered the courage to look toward the doggy door. That's when I saw it, a small, wrinkled head poking through the flap, like a gremlin or some kind of creature, scanning the room. Then its eyes locked on mine. The only light came from the television, flickering across its face. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, though it was probably only a few seconds. Then it slowly pulled back out of sight, never breaking eye contact. I couldn't see any shadow or movement outside afterward, so I was sure it was just standing there. I stayed awake until sunrise, staring at that door, too afraid to move. When daylight finally filled the room, I saw nothing. I never told anyone, because who would believe a kid afraid of the dark? Years later, my dad said a bat had gotten into the house that week, so maybe that's what I saw. But I still remember that face clear as day. Story 41. During marching season last year, we had 3-hour rehearsals every Tuesday night. One of our trumpet players, Ian, was a scrawny, quiet kid with a crazy fast metabolism that kept him rail thin. After a few run-throughs of our show, our band director called a 10-minute water break. Ian and I walked over to a few of our friends and decided to lie down for a bit. When the break ended, everyone got up except Ian. A saxophonist noticed and went to check on him. We joined her, and Ian was completely motionless. His eyes were open, but he wasn't moving or responding. At first, we thought he was having an asthma attack, but he'd never had one and didn't even have asthma. More people started to notice. Our drum major, normally calm and commanding, suddenly turned into a military officer yelling orders, calling for help, keeping people back, and coordinating with the band director and coaches. You could tell he was terrified, even though he stayed in control. We called Ian's mom and emergency services and covered him with a spare blanket while keeping an eye on him. Eventually, help arrived and Ian survived. He can't do much physical activity anymore, but he's alive. What scared me most was realizing that he was dying right next to us, and none of us even noticed until it was almost too late. Story 42. I work in a psychiatric hospital, and I once cared for a patient unlike anyone I've ever seen before. She was severely psychotic, completely detached from reality, and violently self-destructive. She had been placed in seclusion after attacking a staff member. The moment she was left alone, she began smashing her head against the metal door over and over, breaking her face and teeth, blood splattering everywhere. She had promised to do it every time she was secluded, and she always did. Eventually, we learned to put her in restraints as soon as she showed signs of starting, but even then, she'd bite through the inside of her cheeks and tongue until her mouth filled with blood. She went to the emergency room nearly every week, but most of her injuries couldn't even be treated because she refused medical care. Despite heavy doses of antipsychotics, nothing seemed to reach her. I can still hear her screams in my head, the sound of her skull slamming into steel, the sight of her torn cheeks, the thin flaps of skin holding together the deep gashes in her face. It's something you never forget. Story 43. When I was 14, we went to visit my grandfather's grave on the 1-year anniversary of his passing December 23rd. It was my first experience with a close family death, and I didn't really know how to process it. My dad, though, was visibly broken. As we stood by the grave, I heard him quietly mutter, "What's so important about Grand and the Boulevard, an intersection in northeast Philadelphia notorious for deadly accidents?" I thought he was just talking to himself. On our way home, we approached that same intersection. Our light was green, but my dad slammed on the brakes out of nowhere. The car beside us kept going and was immediately T-boned by a truck speeding through the red light at 40 or 50 miles per hour. I watched it happen in slow motion, the impact, the shattering glass, and then the driver's window covered in blood like a horrifying painting. My dad pulled over and told me to stay in the truck. I watched him run to the wreck, shouting, "Oh my God!" over and over. Other drivers stopped to help, including the truck driver, who somehow walked away with just a cut on his forehead. Curiosity got the better of me, and I snuck out to look inside the car. The moment I saw what was left of the driver, broken bones, torn flesh, half a skull, it hit me so hard I vomited right there. My dad caught me and scolded me for leaving the truck. Later, after giving statements to the police, I asked him how he knew to stop when the light was green. He said, "I heard Pop say, 'Stop now.'" I don't know how, but I know it was him. I think he was talking to me at the cemetery, too. From that moment on, I believed in something beyond this life. Story 44. I don't have anything as heavy as war stories or national tragedies, but camping can be terrifying in its own right. The first accident I didn't witness directly, but the aftermath was brutal. I was skipping rocks by the lake when I heard my dad screaming in pain. I ran back to camp and followed a trail of blood leading to our pop-up camper. He wasn't screaming anymore, but when I got there, he turned around grinning through tears and yelled, "Hey, look at this axe, Jake!" There it was, an axe buried deep in his shin, sticking out like a snapped bone. My dad laughed and cried at the same time, then actually pulled it out himself. My mom had to stitch him up right there at camp. He spent the rest of the trip fishing and drinking on one leg. The second time, we were camping in a cabin. Late at night, I got up to pee by the creek nearby. I unzipped, started doing my business, and then heard heavy breathing and splashing. I looked over and saw a baby bear drinking water. Cute, right? Then I heard a deep growl from across the creek, Mama Bear. She was so close I could have peed on her. I froze, mentally lost it, then somehow calmly walked back to the cabin, locked the door, and went to bed pretending nothing happened. The next morning, my mom was upset because bears had scratched up the van she'd left food inside. All I could think was how close I'd come to being dinner. Story 45. When I was 19 and living in Phoenix, Arizona, I was eating lunch at a sandwich shop when I heard a screech and a loud thump. I looked up just in time to see a van skid onto the curb. My friend and I ran outside and found a man lying in the middle of the road. The woman driving the van was shaking, saying over and over, "He just ran out in front of me." The speed limit was 45, so she must have been going at least 50. The windshield was shattered and the front post had a huge dent. The man's shoes had been thrown off from the impact, and his shin bone was sticking straight out of his leg. The asphalt was so hot that day easily over 100 degrees that the blood around him was already thickening on contact. His eyes were open, the blood vessels burst, and no one had touched him yet. I knelt down to check his pulse. When I pressed his neck, blood spurted from his nose and eyes. I yanked my hand back, startled, blurting out, "Oh, he's dead!" The woman started screaming. A plain white van pulled up, and two men, some kind of medics, jumped out. One shot me a disapproving look as if to tell me to shut up. The other said the man still had a faint pulse, though to this day, I think they only said that to calm her down. When they lifted him onto the stretcher, part of his skull flopped downward, and blood cooked on the pavement beneath him. After giving my statement to the police, I went back to work but couldn't last another hour. Even after 25 years, I still see it clearly.